last-minute shake-up at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning, Ryan. It's okay.
And staying in front of the day isn't always as simple as 1, 2, 3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
what's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
You're listening to the NASM-CPT Podcast with Richey, winner of the ShareCare Emmy Award for Social Storytelling and the official podcast of the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Hey, y'all, and welcome to the NASM-CPT Podcast. My name is Richey, and today I'm reaching into the mailbag because Brad, that was a funny story. I grew up with the guys named Brad and Brian, Brian and Brad. They were brothers. And one time Brad was getting married, and everybody knew both of these brothers, and the guy that married them said Brian's name as he was marrying Brad to his wife. And so after it was over, we didn't know who she was married to. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Today, we're talking about lifting for sports performance, not hypertrophy. All right, so this comes from Brad, not Brian. It says, thanks for all the podcasts, so informative, and they've given me a lot of confidence to know that I'm doing things correctly. Also, kid-friendly, I can listen to them with my kids in the room. Thank you so much for that. I have a question about best exercises for an athlete client. When focusing on building strength for an athlete, is it better to do exercises that focus on smaller areas of the body so you can build strength up higher in that area, or focus on full body movements in order to make more muscles work together? For example, a dumbbell row, is it better to kneel on a bench with your hand on the bench supporting your upper body, or is it better to hold a lunge or do a bent over row? Again, thanks. This is for an athlete and not a bodybuilder. From Brian. Just kidding, Brad. So, Brad, thank you so much for the question. And I got a lot to get into with this. Now, one of the things that historically we have concerns about is the lack of stability when you're doing, let's say, a supported anything. So whether you're doing a supported row or supported squats, like on a machine, whether or not that affects you when it comes to your athletic performance. And historically speaking, free weights have been looked at as superior. However, some of the later research that's been coming out doesn't necessarily show that. And there are some things that just kind of take us in different directions. So I want to address the things there, Brad, and talk about what can make a big difference. Now, one thing I know for sure is that when you are doing sports, you are not wearing weight belts when you're playing basketball. You are not wearing weight belts when you are playing football. And so I think that weight belts have their place, even in sports performance, but it is also vital to point out that you need to get off the weight belt off and do some exercises that use your core to help support that movement. One of the things that I find to be important, and I've mentioned this a lot throughout the years, is if I'm doing a bench press, and the NFL has a 225-pound bench press AMAP, right? So how many times can you lift 225 pounds? And the lineman can get upwards to 30 repetitions and more. But what does that actually mean if you can't support that with your core? Now, there's a valid point to that. However, you can do machine-based exercises. You can work with a belt. You can work in a tripod stance or your knee and your hand while doing rows, a dumbbell row. And you can also do it the other way, where you are not supported. You're not doing a Smith machine. You're not doing a leg press. And all of these things have their place, and they all have their place within sports performance. Now, I think that there's one of the things that we look at is, do I want to spend all my time on machines? And definitely not. But do you have to spend all your time on free weights? And the answer is no, you don't. And you can do plenty of supported exercises. So let me get into a couple of things here. I might squint a little bit because I'm going to be reading some things that have come from research that I'm pointing out. So Hernandez Belmonte et al. 2023. It is called Adaptations in Athletic Performance and Muscle Architecture. And I'm not concerned about the muscle architecture for this particular point that we're trying to make, are not meaningfully conditioned by training free weight versus machine-based exercises, challenging a traditional assumption using the velocity-based method. All right, that's from the Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Science and Sports. So we're going to talk a little bit today about velocity-based training. And this is what they're looking at. They say, although superior effectiveness of free weights over machine-based training has been traditionally widespread assumption. So that's been assumed. Longitudinal studies comparing the training modalities were scarce and heterogeneous. So what do they mean? They say we're going to look at the research to use velocity-based training to compare the effects of free weight versus machine resistance training on the athletic performance and muscle architecture. Both training modalities significantly and similarly improved vertical jump, both free weight and the machines, lower limb anaerobic capacity, and then the machine-based group substantially enhanced upper limb anaerobic power, whereas the free weight group significantly improved the change of direction and balance. 2 out of 6 conditions that were analyzed. Changes in sprint capacity, fascial length, pronation angles were not significant for either of the training modalities. So they've kind of finalized with this. Adaptations in athletic performance and muscle architecture would not be meaningfully influenced by the resistance modality trained. Now, that's pretty interesting because we spent so much time throughout the years looking at studies that may not have been the most eventful versions of studies that have said free weights are always better than machines when it comes to athletic performance. And it's not necessarily true. So we're going to get into looking at some other research that gets into it. And then we're going to look at velocity-based training. So how fast are you lifting? And when we look at velocity-based training, what they looked at and they found is that it didn't matter if you did machines or you did free weights. You want to lift fast. Now, for athletic performance, the fast lifting and explosive concentric movement has always been noted. But for bodybuilding or hypertrophy or muscular development, an explosive concentric has never really been the most important thing. We want to maybe slow it down a little bit, have increased time under tension, make sure the muscle is always engaged. When you're lifting for athletic performance, you're not trying to make sure the muscle is always engaged. You're not trying to feel the burn or feel the pump. You're just trying to explode up and lift because most athletic performances are explosive. And then we don't give internal cues. We don't give the squeeze your glutes and make sure you feel it here and make sure you feel it. All we're trying to do, athletic performance, is get from here to here. And we know that those external cues are vitally more important and significantly more effective when we say, let's do a lift like a squat. And we say, explode off of the ground. Look like you're trying to jump. Push the ground away from you. Explode up like a rocket ship. Those are much better than lift up and feel it in your quads and in your glutes. Far less effective. However, a lot of times in bodybuilding, they're not going to do the exploding and things like that. And they lift like a rocket ship, push the ground away from you as fast as you can. They're going to say things like focus on squeezing the glutes, focus on the burn, focus on that. And that's meaningful because they are spending time working the muscle as opposed to getting an athletic outcome. And that's why velocity-based training and these explosive concentrics are very important. Okay, we're going to look at another study, and this one's by Hagen et al. In 2023, the effects of free weights versus machine-based training on maximal strength, hypertrophy, jump performance, a systematic review, and a meta-analysis. But first, this episode of the NASM-CPT Podcast is brought to you by NASM One, the membership for trainers and coaches. Members enjoy unlimited access to hundreds of career resources. Get the Edge app to schedule and program clients. Enjoy half off all certifications and specializations, access free CEUs, and more. All of this for just $35 a month. Go to NASM.org/membership to learn more about NASM 1. Now, the Hagen study about free weights versus machine-based when it comes to strength training and max strength, this is what they looked at. The effectiveness of strength training with free weights versus machine equipment is heavily debated. Thus, the purpose of the meta-analysis was to summarize the data on the effect of free weight versus machine-based training on maximal strength, jump height, and hypertrophy. So what they did, they got 13 studies. They looked at max strength, jump performance, hypertrophy. They had 1,600 participants. And what they did is they go through this study and they found there were no differences detected in the direct comparison of strength, jump performance, and muscle hypertrophy. Current body of evidence indicates that strength changes are specific to the training modality, and the choice between free weights and machines are down to individual preference and goals. Well, let's continue to explore this, and we're going to talk about velocity-based training here. So this is by Held et al. 2022, the effectiveness of traditional versus velocity-based strength training on explosive and maximal strength performance. So the treatments have been summarized into two we're going to look at low velocity loss and high velocity loss. Now, low velocity loss means we didn't lose that much speed. High velocity is that you're training and limiting your rest so that you actually end up losing more speed. So you can lighten the weight and move fast. You can go a heavier weight and move not as fast. You can have the same weight and limit your rest. And one you're moving faster, one you're moving slower. The repetitions in reserve-based training. So repetitions in reserve are repetitions in reserve are basically if you do a 10 rep max and you could do let's say we're going for 10 reps and we say we're going to stop and we're going to give 2 repetitions in reserve. That means you're going to do 8 repetitions. So you can do 8 repetitions nice and clean. You could do 10 nice and clean, but that would have hit exhaustion. You would have, after your 10th one, your form would have started to break down, maybe arching your back, kind of your shoulders hunching in different ways. You know, you got to start moving in a little funky position. So repetitions in reserve, let's go 10 with 2 repetitions in reserve. So that's your 10 rep max, 2 repetitions in reserve. And there are some real good benefits, and maybe I'll do a podcast on repetitions in reserve a little bit later on. But then they look at a traditional 1 rep max based resistance training. And here's what they found. Velocity based training, 1 rep max and repetition in reserve, low velocity, high velocity training, they were ranked for each network based on the P-score rankings. They found that low velocity and high velocity were most favorable when it came to jump, when it came to strength, when it came to sprint, compared to the repetition in reserved and the traditional 1 rep max. So the kind of takeaway here is that low velocity training where low velocity loss. So you're moving really fast and then you rest long enough to continue moving really fast where you're not losing that much velocity, but you're still losing some, versus high velocity loss, which is limiting. So you're going to jump back into the rep and you're not going to be as fast for the next one. And that they consider high velocity loss to be greater than 20% speed. And they show that these two, low velocity and high velocity loss, show notable effects on strength, jump, sprint performance. In particular, for the jump performance, low velocity loss, which is you're not losing nearly as much speed from one set to the next, induced favorable improvements compared to all the other resistance training variables and approaches. So if you really want to spend time focusing on that athletic performance, you can talk about, are we going to do a Smith machine? Are we going to do a leg press? Or is a back squat better? Is a front squat better? Is a squat better? But what they found is all of these are pretty good, and they all have similar outcomes. But when you practice moving fast, that is when you're going to have better athletic performance outcomes. All of this is done with control. And this kind of goes back to our OPT model, where we say none of this heavy lift you'll be able to do if you don't have the core stability to support it. And that's why the OPT model and I will still work with people, and we'll do a little core activation. And that might be stability training, but that might not be stability training. That might be simply loaded carries. And that might be even some crunches or extensions of the spine. But we're doing things to kind of prep the core, let the core know it's happening. I'll do shoulder exercises for stability, hip work for stability. Because if you can't stabilize the joint, you can't produce force from the joint. So it's all kind of movement prep. It's part of the warm up. And then we get into the lifts. And of course, starting off with lighter lifts and very specific to your training. If you're doing squats, do some lighter squats to prep the body, and then add your weight, and then add your speed. All right, Brad, I hope you found this helpful, and I hope everyone else did too when it comes to looking at sports performance. Also, when you're just working with clients, it's fun to play with different variables, and tempo is one of the most underutilized variables. One of the things we tell people to do more often than not is to slow down. But sometimes it's nice to have people speed up and do explosive velocity-based movements. And that's why, if you ever wonder why in the power phase of the OPT model, when you're going to do a max strength lift, it's going to be as fast as you can possibly do, but it's heavy, so you ain't moving that fast. But then you're going to superset it with something lighter that you're moving incredibly fast. Something called post-activation potentiation. We're using a heavy lift to activate all the muscle fibers, and then you're going to do something explosively where those muscle fibers that lift really heavy and move really fast are worked in two different ways, back to back post-activation. After you activate them with a heavy lift, we work on the potential for them by doing something light and explosive. All of this can be worked back into the NASM OPT model and how you train. Thanks for listening. Like, subscribe, share with your fitness friends and family. And if you got questions for me, like Brad and his brother Brian did, then you can hit me up. You can do so on Instagram at dr.rickrichey, or email me rick.richey@nasm.org. Y'all keep inspiring people to fitness. Thanks for listening. This has been the NASM CPT Podcast.